As your association president, I welcome all you people who joined the regiment and went overseas in 1939, plus the fact we welcome all Seaforths from everywhere across the country. We're hearing from you all the time, and it's marvelous that you're keeping in touch with us.
Well, welcome to the 50th anniversary of when our battalion went to war in the Second World War. It seems a long, long time ago now, and looking back on some of the memories of 50 years ago, I find that I really have to do a little bit of digging to come up with what I think went on at that time.
Hi, my name is Robbie Clark, and I'm the 36th Commanding Officer of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. And on behalf of the serving battalion, I'd like to welcome you all to this auspicious occasion. And I'd also like to thank the organizers and executive of the Regimental Association for asking the serving battalion to join in the festivities. We should look upon occasions like this as being few and far between, and therefore we should cherish them. This is a chance where we can all get together as a family and discuss many things, both past, present, and future, and maintain an interest in each other over the next few years to come.
Hello, my name is Don Vandervoort. I'm the first Vice President of your association. It's my pleasure to be here and to help commemorate the anniversary of the 50th second call to arms.
Well, it's a great honor and a great privilege to be a part of this very great occasion, the 50th anniversary, to our participation in the Second World War. And I also know that there are not that many of us left that are here to celebrate such an occasion. And so therefore I'm doubly honored.
I'd like to welcome all the old 39ers especially, and every Seaforth to the reunion. I hope you have all a good time. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I welcome this opportunity to say a few words on the 50th anniversary of the Seaforth in Call to Arms.
Hello, friends. I regret that I am unable to be with you on this occasion on the second call to arms in September of this year. Unfortunately, I have had to go to Britain to see a sick relative and have to miss this very great occasion. But I wish you all the very best, and remember all the good times that we've gone through, and remember our departed comrades.
Well, I'd like to welcome all the 39ers and the hard times you had in the early days, and especially the first part of England, but we all stuck together, and it's great to be together here and to meet them all and talk again about the good times, and we forget about the bad times. The good times are the ones we remember.
Hi, fellow Seaforths. It's a great privilege for me to be here to greet past and present Seaforths on this great anniversary of the second call to arms.
Welcome to the 50th anniversary of the Seaforths. I was very, very fortunate to join a terrific regiment.
I'm very glad and very thankful to be here at the 50th anniversary of the Seaforths call-up. And I want to welcome all my pals and buddies and everyone, especially those from out of town, to this gathering.
I'd like to congratulate all the boys in the Seaforths that joined in '39 and went overseas at that time. And I would like to be here, but I'm going away, so I send you my best.
Yeah, I'm quite thankful to get the opportunity on this, the 50th anniversary of the Second World War, to recall some of the memories that I can think back of.
I'm very pleased to be able to participate in the 50th anniversary of the second call to arms of Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. And I welcome all the Seaforths assembled here tonight.
My name is Gordy Whitting, and it's quite an honor for me to be here tonight, and maybe I'm kind of fortunate to be here tonight because I've lost a lot of good friends, but it's the second call to arms of the Seaforth, and it's 50 years since I joined up.
I'm one of many who were delighted to congratulate all the 39ers who actually did the big thing and joined up and went into the service, and of course they carried on the fantastic traditions of the regiment.
It's a pleasure to be here today on the 50th anniversary of the second call of arms.
Yes, I'm Denny Baker, and I'd like to bring greetings to all my old comrades on this, the 50th anniversary of your second call to arms.
Well, as a reasonably recent CO of the battalion, I'm particularly pleased to be helping to celebrate this 50th anniversary of the unit going away. I wasn't, needless to say, a member of the unit going away at that time. In 1939, I was 11 years of age. But my father had been a Seaforth cadet in 1911, 12, and 13 before he became a member of the Seaforth Company that joined the Canadian Scottish and went overseas in the First World War. So I knew all about the Seaforth, and that was the one thing that I wanted to join.
When war was declared on September the 1st, there were 6 boys in our family, 3 of them older than I, and they all left immediately to join up. One went to the 6th Field Squadron, Royal Canadian Engineers, one went to the Navy, and one went to the Westminster Regiment. I was all hot to trot myself when my father asked me to stay back a week because at that time Canada had not declared war. They did not declare war until the 10th of September. So anyway, the whole picture changed when my 3 brothers came home the first weekend, all in uniform. So I made it known that I was going to borrow the family car and head in for Vancouver and join up.
And we had them wire back to see if I could get in the Navy, myself and Trev Griffith. And we waited, and it took so long, so we went. This morning, we stayed in the Mission, as a matter of fact, down on the lower end of Vancouver there. And we decided that we woke up this morning, well, we'll go out and we'll join the first outfit we see. So the first thing we saw was a fellow in kilts out on the street. So down to the armories we came.
I came into the armories, and being an ex-soccer player, or playing at the time for the Wild Duck Inn out at Maple Ridge area, I wanted to get on the soccer team, and I ran into a fellow called Bob Peebles, and he told me, this is the outfit to join. We're going to have a soccer team. So consequently, I joined.
I was quite proud to be a Seaforth, yet I didn't want to join the Seaforth. When we originally were going to join up, we decided maybe we would join the Navy. So we went to the Navy, and of course they turned us down because we didn't have any previous experience. So then we decided to go to the Air Force, and we went to the Air Force, and they turned us down because I had to have a university education in those days. So that led us out there. So I said, well, I'll never join a Highland regiment because I don't like to have to wear a kilt because I was pretty bow-legged and skinny. But the next day I was down here, and we joined the Seaforth.
I carried on in Vancouver on the Monday, and driving up Burrard Street, and I heard the bagpipes playing across the street from the armory. So that intrigued me, and I parked the car and walked in through the main door. It just happened that in those days, the first week of war anyway, they were mounting a guard on the armory, the Seaforth in full scarlet. And much to my surprise, the guard on duty was a chap named Ross McLeod, who came from Maple Ridge, an old friend of mine. So he asked me what I was doing, and I told him I came to join up, and I asked him where to go. So he tucked his rifle behind the door, and he took me in, showed me where to sign up on the big tables. So it took me about 2 hours, and I was told to come back in 2 days' time. I went back to say goodbye to Ross, and he was under close arrest for having deserted his post. That was the first lesson I learned.
It was amazing how they recruited so many people. The Depression was still on in 1939, and we had the most motley bunch of volunteers that the world has ever seen. We had men who were Hollywood movie stars. We had millionaires from the United States. We had mercenaries that followed wars from one place to the other.
I think our first few days were rather hectic because I hate to say this in front of some of our senior officers now, but things weren't really going very smoothly in those days. And I must say they were mostly concerned with us being brought in, attested, and given bits and pieces of uniform.
We had no equipment, of course. All we had was the ragbag stuff that we'd had in the happy days of peace.
And I guess we were among the first ones to join, really. They had no accommodation. They set up beds and so on over here in the what is now called the private's mess. And they fed us. They had a kitchen set up in the armories, in the gym there. So we ate there and slept upstairs. And it was quite a novelty for a while. We used to go out and raise hell in the evenings. And
I joined up on active service in September 1939, and it was quite an experience to see all these new people coming in. And for weeks, people were parading it with rifles, and they were in civilian suits. And it was quite a long time before we eventually got battle dress. And of course, all of us who had kilts were most upset that we had to turn our kilts in and go into battle dress, and some people even threatened to go on strike.
And of course that shook everybody, and the morale was not very good when they found out that. But I issued the first battle dress to a man who was going to attend his father's funeral. And when he stepped out of the quartermaster's stores, we almost had a riot to think that we would be wearing battle dress.
Rumors started going pretty early in early November that we, the Seaforths, were being slated for overseas. And this all came to fruition about the end of November when we were very busy getting the new battle dress, and we had moved into the huts in the armory here by this time. And we're marching up and down Kitsilano, practicing ack-ack drill, firing the Lewis gun.
And there was one funny incident. The Princess Patricia, the light infantry, were teaching us the working of arms. The Bren gun was just out, and somehow or other somebody had taken a 22-inch rifle, and they couldn't find it. And I remember the message coming across so clearly, and it said that this battalion will not proceed to war until that 22-inch rifle is turned in. And if I'd only known that now, I don't think they'd ever found that rifle. But anyway, we went.
We continued then to teach PT, and on the odd rainy day, we stood on the balcony, and while Lieutenant Danby gave the exercises, I went through the motions of them.
I was very fortunate indeed, because I was sort of on the center stage, and I would have the NCOs demonstrate, and I watched everybody else to make sure they were doing what they're supposed to be doing. But anyway, I guess this was my first taste of command, and it stood me in good stead.
It's quite a sight to see the 500 or 600 men down on the main floor down here inside the armory doing PT. 3 instructors in the balcony. It was even more of a sight to the girls in the biscuit factory across the street when we were told to get on the backs down and lift legs by numbers. I'm sure they got quite a thrill out of that also.
We got to the point where we were all assembled one day, and we were instructed by Colonel Leslie that he wanted to differentiate between those who, for various reasons, had to stay and those who would join on active service. And I remember the order was given, those who wish to go on active service, take one step forward. Those who don't, remain fast.
Well, frankly, that was a bit of a surprise. At that time, I had a baby boy, 6 months old, and that's pretty hard, but I did.
And I can remember Colonel Leslie coming over to me and saying, you don't have to go. He knew my parents and knew I was the only one in the family, and suggested that I consider it and maybe go at a later date. And I said, no, I'm going to fight for king and country, as my father had done in the First Great War. And
finally, the balloon went up, and we had to go overseas. Now, I was CSM, Company Sergeant Major, and there were no D Company. And we marched out of the armories brave and strong, right down across Burrard Street and down Granville Street, and away we went, Burrard Street, and away we went.
I was pretty lucky. I got out of most route marches. In fact, I tried to get out of the one coming up on Granville Street, but the Major General caught me and said, "You're going to walk up this one."
And I can remember marching out of the armories, and many of us had hangovers. I think mine was quite subsided by this point. But I remember one fellow in particular was in very bad shape in the center file. And I remember handing my rifle to my parents and said, "Will you handle this? I've got to handle his rifle," and prop him up at the same time.
The artillery were there, and 2 or 3 other units lining the square, along with a multitude of people, of course, all the way down to the station.
And it was the most amazing thing to walk down Granville Street in those days, because we were accompanied by a lot of old chaps from the First War, friends of my father's, and one guy had my rifle. And I got on the train, I didn't have a rifle, but he did manage to throw it in the window, and we got going.
Prior to the outbreak of war, Tom Leslie had given a silver bugle to the pipe band. And he had laid down that this particular silver bugle was not to go overseas. So Dad and Tom Leslie, Dad was a lieutenant or a captain at the time, and the depot was part of it. And we're down to see the troops off on the CPR station. And apparently the train was pulling out, and about 100 yards down the thing, Craig Smith, if you remember him, Craig was the side drummer and a very competent Scottish drummer. He apparently leaned out the window and with the silver bugle played the most beautiful charge. Well, I take it from then on the wires started going down to Calgary, and any place the troop train stopped to get the silver bugle back. Whether it ever came back or not, I never know.
The first thing I remember on the train is when we get to Kamloops, and they sent the orderly sergeant out to buy some sugar for the officer's rum, and he got caught in the crowd, and he couldn't get back on the train. And of course, and eventually he was regarded as a deserter from the army. The war had only been on a couple of months, and this guy was a deserter from the army. But when we got to Halifax, he was there waiting for us. He'd got on the next train and got a first-class trip across the country while we were route marching and doing all kinds of horrible things.
One place in Ontario, I can't quite remember the name of it, cold as a son of a bee. Can I use that language?
Oh, yeah, sure. There were some interesting calls. I remember one in particular was the call in Riviere, where we stopped in Riviere-du-Loup. And I always remember 2 or 3 guys that could speak French, and they did far better with the girls who came on board to wish us goodbye than those of us who couldn't.
I think the troop train was one that my parents most likely came over in 1911, and kind of an immigrant train of some kind.
Anyhow, from there we went on to Halifax, and it was a very cold, snowy day when we arrived, and we boarded ship, and late in the afternoon we took off, and it was very rough once we got outside of the Halifax harbor.
And she took us overseas, and we were point ship on the whole convoy, which was quite a... We had the old Dunkirk with us, and the Revenge and the Repulse, I think it was, or the Renown, one of the two.
And anyway, we got aboard the ships and the Andes. It was our maiden voyage, and we sailed to England. And one come to think that many private soldiers, they were in lovely suites and had stewards still working for them, and they thought this is a good army.
It didn't seem like an army establishment at all when you were able to sit down and have the stewards bring you your meals.
And I was only a company quartermaster sergeant, and yet I was given a full cabin complete with shower, bath, and telephone. And I remember staying in the cabin and thinking, well, this is the colonel's room, I'll just keep my equipment on until he kicks me out. But it wasn't, it was so.
I lived with Tom Hughes, and in our cabin we had a press do thing for press the pants. So we were the smartest looking soldiers aboard, I guess.
The thing that was plentiful was the beer. There was all kinds of beer, very hoppy beer. but we soon learned to put the plug in the bathtub and fill up the bathtubs with beer. So we had a supply. We didn't run short.
One thing I do remember about the beer on the ship, it was disgusting. It was a swill as far as we were concerned, and it had hops floating on the top.
And I never forget the Christmas dinner on December the 25th, 1939. And that was complete with all courses of all the food that you could think of.
All the way over on the Andes, I was one of the ones doing this ack-ack guard, as we called it, with the Lewis guns. And for some reason or other, starting in Halifax, we did this 4 on, 4 off, all the way across that damned ocean. And of course, we never saw anything.
And one other incident on the boat that I do recall was the night I'd gone to bed early, and there was a bunk above me, and this fellow, he was an American fellow, and he came in the worse for wear, and he dropped his cigarette butt on my blanket, which went on fire. And next thing I know, the cabin was full of smoke, and I got up and opened the porthole, which I should not have done because it would have given our position away. All of a sudden, there was banging on the door, and along came the orderly officer, who I think was Keith Murdoch, accompanied by the orderly sergeant, who I can't recall who. And they couldn't see us because the smoke was so heavy. So finally, I think we threw the blanket in the bathtub and got it out.
Arrived in England, in Scotland, I should say, Gurrick. We're on the train down to Aldershot on New Year's Eve of 1939, 1940.
It wasn't a pleasure to a great many Scots people to be on a train in Glasgow on Hogmanay and not being able to get a drink. Everybody was celebrating, but it didn't do us any good.
And then we got to Farnborough. We got off and fell in line, and we were walking, or marching, as I say, to the barracks, Delville Barracks, when we come to a corner. A little girl, about 11 years old, had dashed to the corner, and a little boy about 8 and a little boy about 5. And they were watching us. A little boy of 5 says, "Oh," he says, "look at the soldiers." And no, says the girl, they meant soldiers, they was Canadians. That was our welcome to Farnborough.
And arriving in Melville and Dorval barracks, it was extremely cold, and there was no central heating in England. Everybody came down with the flu.
I remember there were 80 men to a room, and I think it was 1 pound of coal per man. In any event, what did surprise us there was that all the coal was painted white. That was one of the duties of the defaulters.
And that was a terrible time. Everybody had the flu. One morning on parade, I had 7 people on parade out of my company. That's all I had.
Oh yes, everybody got the flu. I remember visiting people in the hospital, and the hospitals were so cold, and they had no heat or anything like that, and the fellas were in bed with their greatcoats on. And of course the ghosts were walking up and down the corridors. Almost every hospital in England, I think, has ghosts somewhere. So I think it was Anne Boleyn was walking up and down this one. I'm not too sure.
In that time, I had a course at the Aldershot Physical Training School, and I also had a course at Hythe Small Arms School. These were very interesting, of course.
I took up a course in chiropody with a place in Leatherhead, and I enjoyed that very much, and it also made me the chiropodist for the battalion. And believe you me, I have some pretty ugly feet. No pretty ones, believe me.
Well, after we were in England, and it was the first burn supper we had, and we decided to get a pig, it was, yeah, a roast bubbly jock, I think they call it. And we had a terrible time. The black market was on. Farmers weren't supposed to kill anything unless they had permission from the government. But we finally found out a farmer who said that he would sell us a pig, but we could not kill it on his farm because he would get into trouble. There would be evidence of a pig being slaughtered, and he would get most likely put in jail or something. So we sent the cooks out, and they chloroformed the pig. And they brought it back through the line, and then the sergeant cook slaughtered the pig, and when he'd slaughtered the pig, he threw the entrails down a toilet. We were in barracks, and we did have toilets, all right. And then in the commotion of the chloroform and everything else, he lost his false teeth down the toilet too, and he flushed the whole thing away. Well, the next thing we know, the drains were plugged, and they called in the plumbers. And when they called in the plumbers, they found the entrails of a pig and a guy's false teeth. And I'm not a man that knows much about anatomy, but it seems to me that the entrails of a pig is very much like the entrails of a human being. So they called in Scotland Yard. They thought a murder had taken place. And I was grilled every day for an awful long time. But they couldn't find anybody that was missing, so they were all there and everything else. And even when I was in Italy, a lot later on, they were still worrying about this murder that had taken place.
Well, then we joined up and became known as McNaughton's Flying Circus. And we were flying all over England, and we were going haywire. We were driving here one day out and into bushes and trees and sleeping out, and we didn't know what was going on.
Even went to Aldershot, to Salisbury Plains, and we practiced the old trench warfare that they did in 1914, 1918. Got covered with chalk, got thoroughly browned off, and I think we started finally coming together as a unit.
It was a place I always wanted to go to as a youngster, maybe because my mother and father come from there, and I'd always been schooled in the virtues of what we now term the old country.
We saw a good many camps in England for various reasons of doing training, one camp or another, and seeing the countryside while we were at it, on foot mostly. Our accommodations went from castles to tents.
This was a place called Nags Hall Farm in the south of England. It was owned by Arthur J. Rank, the great film producer. And we lived on his farm in tents. And we had lots of exercises. Every day we had to get out and do this and do that and everything else. And every day we didn't have any water. He was Corporal Pendlebury was on the water truck, and that's what we depended on for water. So when the water didn't show up at the proper time, then the exercises didn't get off on time, and everything got delayed day after day after day. And I told the pipe major this, and in fact, Pendlebury told me that he had never heard Reveille. That was due to the pipe major. He had a buglers and pipers played Reveille. Johnny Cope, I think's the name. And then, anyway, I got this bugler, or Ed got this bugler, to go into where this waterman was sleeping. He was sleeping in a manger, which is rather appropriate. And he blew the Reveille, long Reveille, right in his ear. And the water was still late.
One of the incidents there that I recall was a fellow like Bob Llewellyn, which sorrowfully he was killed in Italy, but was quite a gambler. And he said to me, he says, "I'll bet you 10 quid the war's over by Christmas." So I put a little psychology together. I thought, well, if I lose, I'm not going to go anyway. But if I win, I'm going to be 10 quid better. So I got the 10 quid and smiled happily, and I got a booze up.
You must realize I was an RQMS. I was a wet nursing these people. I wasn't a real fighting guy like these other fellows was, like Bob and Andy Folds and all those fellows. I was wet nursing. I was looking after rations. I was looking after ammunition. I was looking after clothing. I was arranging visits with rear parties and advance parties. And looking, even when I came home, I used to look into a room and see how many men I thought could sleep in here. You could do pretty well in this place, too, I tell you.
So eventually, when this went on for a while, we settled down in Oxted. And that's when I first realized that this was no joke, this war. Up until then, it had been a bit of a joke. We were just outside of London, and we got the first daylight raids, and there was 1,000 bomber raids going on for upwards of a month. And it was something to see. We knew that they were Canadians, although they weren't firing Canadian planes. They were firing with the RCAF or with the RAF, and they were shooting these big bombers out of the sky. And as you know, at that time, the area was bombed pretty badly, but we were just on the edge of it, and things went eventually that they had to give up the daylight bombing, and the RAF proved that they were the mastery of the Luftwaffe.
We had a fella, a very good soldier, called Leon Papel with us, and he used to go to London all the time and stayed with a very wealthy family. But most of the time he didn't have a pass. But one time I was sitting in the orderly room on a Saturday afternoon, things were quiet in B Company, and the telephone rang, and it was a field phone, so you knew it was coming through from division. And it was a British officer at Henrietta Street in London, which is the home of the Army jail. They said they had picked up Private Papel because he didn't have a pass. But he stated that he did have a pass, but he had lost it. Now he said, we just want to confirm this. Is he on leave? So I said, just a moment, and I'll check. So I put the phone down and rustled a few papers and came back and said, oh yes, he's on leave. Would you please issue him another pass so that he won't be bothered anymore? The gentleman on the other end of the phone said, thank you very much, sir. And that was how Papel beat that rap.
Then we came down and we were stationed at Danny Park, Eastbourne, and many of you will remember the nights we used to have to go down and guard the point. The name I can't recall, and we'd go down there with our food and our rations for the night, and stay overnight. And then, of course, we'd be relieved the next morning. And we used to love to tell scary stories about, with all the sea pounding. Imagine if the Germans could just sneak in while the sea is pounding, we'd never hear them. And one or two fellows used to love to enlarge on these stories and scare the daylights out of some of the more timid ones.
There were a good many miles of marching in England. I think we saw every cobblestone road there was in the back of the south of England. One famous one was the 20-mile march, which everybody will remember. 3 days at 20 miles a day.
Well, I can remember walking along, and the fellow next to me would be asleep and still walking. He's fine as long as you don't turn corners. He keeps going, you know.
As I say, you march 3 days, 20 miles a day. Actually, it was all just in a big circle for training, but you thought nothing of it. And there were very, very few dropped out. Actually, there was only, if I remember rightly, there was only one truck. So if anybody dropped out, there was only one small truck for the whole regiment. There was no room to drop out anyway.
1943, I was promoted RSM of the regiment, which was a very distinct honor, one I was very proud of. And I was purportedly the youngest RSM ever to be promoted to that rank in the Canadian Army or even the British Army.
The training continued, and then eventually we went to Scotland, to Inverary, and we did combined ops training at the Duke of Argyll's estate. One thing I do recall about that was being dumped in the water in February at about 3 in the morning up to our waists, and wading ashore and then lying there for about an hour waiting for an attack. And you had never heard so many disgruntled people in all your life.
This story appertained to when we were doing our embarkation training in LCAs in Inverary, Scotland. And we were out there in pretty cold weather. I think it was in February, something like that. It was hellish and cold. And we'd gone out in the boat to practice this, and we were coming back in when a rope got tangled up in the propeller. The chief petty officer, I think he was, ordered the rating over the side, get the rope off. Now the water's cold, And he gave a valiant effort, but he couldn't do it, so they pulled him back aboard. And then the chief himself went over, and he hacked and chewed out for a while, and he couldn't get it off, and we pulled him in. And then in the background, a voice said, "As senior officer afloat, I will do it." And he jumps over the side, and he actually did it. But no names, no pack drill. If you switch that off, I can tell you who it was.
And of course, the character of them all was the postal sergeant. My father, in the First War, was a postal sergeant, so I had a pretty warm spot for him anyway. But he was a chap called William Sinclair, and he was born in the county near Duke of Sutherland's estate, near there, I forget, near Wick, in the very north part of Scotland, up and around John O'Groats. And he left school when he was 8 years of age. He was a poacher, and I've never, in all my life, met a man that was more intelligent than he was. He wasn't educated, but I'm using the word intelligent. And he was the greatest guy for morale you ever saw in your life. He started in England even to wear a top silk hat. He had a friend who had been a magician of some kind, so he wore his uniform and a top silk hat. And one time I said that it didn't look very good for a soldier to wear a top silk hat. That, you know, we all had to wear Balmorals and all this kind of stuff, and your collar's always buttoned up and all the rest of it. And this fellow wore a top silk hat. So I said to him, "Bill, you can't wear that hat. You'll have to wear an ordinary Balmoral like the rest of us do." Well, I was called in front of the colonel and told that if Bill Sinclair wanted to wear a top silk hat, he'd wear a top silk hat. So that was that. Of course, I was a great friend of his. And I remember one time going up to Loch Fyne, which was the Duke of Argyll's estate, and we were all on a route march there. And coming along the other way in a little cart driven by a horse was the Duke of Argyll, and sitting next to him was Bill Sinclair. And he lifted his hat. It was damn decent of him. As we walked along, he lifted his hat to acknowledge us as we were tramping along the road.
Anyway, throughout our stay in England, I got involved with this soccer team, and we ended up having a lot of fun, and we won the Canadian Army Championships. And to this day, I don't think I think it was one team we were all privates, and we were quite proud of it. We had a corporal as our manager, Alec Farmer, who sorrowfully got killed at Ortona. But anyway, the whole area, the whole thing was a wonderful experience.
And I must tell you something about the day we were leaving Greenock to go to Sicily. And we had to use the scrambling nets to get practiced on ascending and descending from a boat. And as we were scrambling up the scrambling net with all your pack and stuff on my left-hand side was, with the head out of a porthole, was what I can only describe as the most beautiful blonde I ever saw in my life. And on the right-hand side, also with the head out of a porthole, was a very charming redhead, beautifully made up. So I and those who were with me automatically took it that we had some very pretty nurses going with us overseas. No more was said, but the first order of the day, the following day, was, I can't quote it, but it was something like, "To all ranks, there will be no fraternizing with those two willing but able seamen."
I remember getting on the ship in Glasgow and everybody going along, and at that particular time we had an officer by the name of Donald Harley. We all know him affectionately as Lulu. And brother, I'm telling you, if your mother looked after you when you were a baby, this fellow looked after you just like that. And his men meant more to him than anything. And he had us going on a thing called meprocaine. It wasn't a drug or anything. It was something that stopped you from getting malaria. And he used to walk around and tick you off on the list to make sure you took it. And he had us so scared of mosquitoes that when we went into Sicily, without a word of a lie, I was more scared of mosquitoes than I was of the Germans. Unfortunately, there wasn't too many there, but this is the type of thing, the type of officer he was. He wanted his men looked after.
Now the Circassia, that was rather, it was a month long. They told us that at one time we were about 200 miles off New York, coming back down to go along the African coast to go to the Mediterranean.
I was on the Circassia as a standby divisional headquarters because the brigade commander, Brigadier Vokes, was named as the standby divisional commander in the event that anything happened to the headquarters ship, the Hillary. So happened everything went according to Hoyle, except that the ship, the Merchant of Venice, that happened to have all my kit on it, and George Kitchen's kit was the one that was sunk. So we lost all our goodies. Not that there were anything very special.
And there's a sight there I think I'll never forget. You could never erase it. We were steaming into Sicily, and coming from the Suez, there was a convoy bigger than ours. So you talk about seeing ships. And of course, when we got into the Mediterranean, it was stormy. Oh, it was, and that lulled the Sicilians to the point that they said, oh, we'll never land.
So I guess to confuse the enemy, we kept on steaming way past Sicily, and then in the night, we turned around and came back, and the first thing I can remember is hearing these planes going overhead. They were carrying airborne troops, and many of the poor devils were let go by their, what do you call the tow planes, and they were cast off too soon, and many of them ended up in the Saltchuk and got drowned.
At the actual invasion, I was a company runner for Sid Thompson, and we were all allocated seats on the landing craft Assault. And well, maybe half an hour before we were ready to embark, I got very, very nervous indeed. And I presumed that I was the only one in the whole shipload or the whole battalion that was frightened, scared.
And the high command were prepared to beach the ships if necessary, but the invasion would go on.
When I finally got over the side and into my landing craft, there was people on either side of me, but I didn't want to touch them. I didn't want to sit too close to them in case they found out I was shaking. But as we started heading for the beach and the odd shell started to come and the waves kind of shook the boat a little bit, I started to slip off the seat. And as I went to save myself from falling on the floor, I put my hand on the two knees on either side of me, who belonged to two NCOs that I thought were afraid of nothing. And their knees were shaking just as bad as mine was.
You could hear the British battleships supporting us, shelling the positions on the land. And some of them were not that far away, and they were ear-splitting shots they let go. And I know this was all a new experience to us. We'd never seen the Navy work in conjunction with the Army before.
And when we got to shore, I jumped ashore and landed up to my waist in water, but afterwards I suffered because the sand in the water got into my shoes and I didn't realize it. And that makes for awfully hot feet.
If I recall, the only man killed on our particular thing was the poor naval fellow. He got got shot right through the head as he was lowering the ramp, and then we all came off. And here again, we were running around listening for the buzz of mosquitoes, and of course, this was something, I guess, it took our minds off what was happening.
There wasn't very much activity on our immediate front. Over on the right, we could hear some firing, but the Italians were facing us, and then they were gradually withdrawing because I guess the heavy fire from the naval ships had made them think twice about staying in the position where they were.
Actually, it was a piece of cake compared to what we've been told it might be.
The other thing that was outstanding at that particular time, being Sid's runner, I had to go and make contact with the Americans on our left flank. And as everybody knows, we had when we landed, we marched practically all the way up. But when I got to them, which would be plus about 2 hours, they had 1,500 weights, 3-tonners. They even had an ice cream truck there giving ice cream to the Italian kids.
On the first day, I thought the war was over because there must have been at least 7,000 or 8,000 fellows walked by, great big 6-foot guys, and they were all blonde, and I thought, God, these have got to be paratroopers from the German army. They turned out to be Italians from the north. They had had enough of their war, and they were given up. They almost swamped our actual landing with so many prisoners given up the first day.
We landed at a place called Pacino Beach, and then Pacino Village, and then we went up through Spica, Modica, Caltagirone up to the center part of Sicily, and made the wheel for we were the wheel for the British Army. Between the American and the British, and were ourselves. And the 1st Canadian Division at that time then was attached to the British 8th Army, where we had a good big ceremonial, 2 big ceremonials, to meet with General Montgomery and to be welcomed in by Montgomery into the family of the 8th Army.
You see, when we got into Sicily, they had great ideas about fighting this war like they did the First World War. And they figured that a piper would lead them into action. Well, the most stupid thing in the world if you ever saw Sicily with all the rocks and everything else. And this was the idea that the piper leads you into battle. This is great old Scottish tradition, I guess. And a lot of pipe majors or pipers in the First War, I think, got medals posthumously, mostly.
Sicily was hot, dirty, sandy, and a big difference to what we had come used to in England.
But then the colonel wanted to have a pipe band play for some kind of a ceremony where Montgomery was there. So he called for the pipe band, and of course they had a terrible time finding the pipers. They were all spread all over Sicily in different companies. And he said that from then on, that he would keep the pipe band all together, and they would do other duties. Like I remember the sergeant, drummer, he looked after the ammunition, and the other pipers did this and that and everything else. And of course they were always called upon after some village was taken to go and play through the streets of this village, like Naples or Agira or Leonforte or any of those places. But that's how they got the pipe band together, because you can't really have a pipe band doing all kinds of dirty work and then all of a sudden expect them to appear as first-class musicians.
The Italians, I think, at this point had surrendered, and an armistice was in the process of being signed. And then we met the Germans, and that was a different story altogether. They were very aggressive, and so then we realized that we were really in the war.
And at Blunder Hill, we lost quite a few fellows. And one of our first aid men got the MM first looking after them there. And then from there we went on to Sicily, on to Leonforte, where we had a bad one.
So we went on, and of course we had the battle at Leonforte, which was a tragedy because we lost a lot of good men, which were killed by our own artillery.
We were, it was July 21st, 1943, at 3:25 in the afternoon. The CO, Colonel Hofmeister at that time, Colonel Hofmeister, who was CO of the regiment, he had the old group at 3:25. We just got up, and the Captain Strain, who was our adjutant, turned to me and said, "Mr. Ireland, go down and get the Pioneer platoon, and we're going into the attack, and I'll describe it to you on the way." And you'd no sooner finish this than these 7 5.5 shells came down and just knocked out some 28 of us right in the O group. Well, it was all our command, because it was an O group of our own commanding officers commanding, company commanders, and and the supporting arms commanders. Excuse me. So our attack had to be canceled because we suffered such severe casualties.
And round about this time, we got what I consider to be a saint. We got a padre by the name of Padre Durnford. And that man, without a word of a lie, was the inspiration of the whole regiment. He thought more of the boys. He was there every time a man was hurt, and nobody could ask for a finer man than Padre Durnford. I think he was the finest man that was in the Seaforth, without a word of a lie.
And we were on our way to Algeria when all of a sudden we discovered the RAP truck, that's the medical truck, was leading the troops into Algeria. Off we got. Colonel Hoffmeister got us, and we wondered what on earth had happened.
Also at that time we lost a good M.O. by the name of MacDonald, who insisted on going forward to Tweedy's men, and we'd known him being with the soccer team. We used to follow the soccer team quite closely, and he won quite a bit of money on us betting up at headquarters, and he doubled up every time, and he made quite a bit of money on it. He helped us out too, and by giving us a few pounds to get ourselves wet-lipped.
The doctor and I and another fellow went out to pick up a casualty, and I was bandaging, and the doctor stood up. And when he stood up, all of a sudden he said, "Oh, I'm hit," and that's all he said. We killed him. So poor Vic and I, we said, we can't leave him here. They were also using incendiary burners to burn things up. So we were right alongside a little irrigation ditch. So my friend's a big fella. He grabbed me by the shoulders and I grabbed her by the feet. We walked down the water to our waist, looking for a break. We found a break and just got there in time. And boy, oh boy, I'll tell you, they clipped every piece of glass that was growing in there at the top.
We went on from there, and next thing I recall quite vividly was the end of the battle around Mount Etna. And I can remember Captain Don Harley we had to pack our mortars up on donkeys and up into get them into position because we couldn't move our vehicles there. And I remember poor Don was, I don't know what happened, but he fell off the donkey and he got kicked. And he went down the line as a casualty.
Bill Sinclair arrived in Sicily about 30 days after the rest of us. And of course, if he ever got sick or anything like that, we nursed him through all kinds of ailments because he didn't want to leave the unit. He loved it. And he wore the top silk hat. And then the great story, of course, is that one day General Montgomery was driving along the street, one of the highways there, and he saw, as he says, I'll repeat what Montgomery says, it's not quite true. He said that coming towards him was a man, a naked man, driving a truck, wearing a top silk hat. This is in the Army when things are pretty grim. And he issued an order to the, he knew it was a Seaforth, the guy had his number of the truck, which was 61. He wrote an order to the colonel, or the whole brigade, and said that he had never issued an order yet on dress in the 8th Army, but he was this time, that no man was entitled to wear a top silk hat. And of course we got the message, and we paid no attention to it.
After the fall of Sicily, we had a rest in Militello, and then prepared for the crossing of the Straits of Messina.